All right, today is week 4 of a relationship series that we've just entitled For Better or Worse. For Better or Worse. And today we're going to look at the topic, how do you deal with conflict? How do I handle a fight? How do I handle disagreement in a relationship with my spouse or any relationship for that matter? I've entitled my message for you note takers this morning, Help! We're fighting again. Help, we're fighting again. Now, before we jump into this message, I want to kind of remind you of the why behind this series. There are a lot of you that come and are really super blessed by a series like this. You're super encouraged. You're getting a lot that you need. And I know that there's a lot of you that may be frustrated and maybe even annoyed with a series like this, because often in a series like this, many are wounded and are hurting and feel like messages like this just open more of that wound, and you walk out of here hurting and you walk out of here bleeding, even more frustrated with your relationships. Maybe because of past relationships, maybe because of a current relationship that you're in right now, and you're thinking, man, there's no hope for us. And as you hear these biblical standards, you're probably thinking, well, that's not us, honey. We sure blew that one, right? Dude, like I liked you, but now I know what's going to happen. My spouse is going to nag me on the car ride home all the way home, right? I want you to know that I see you and I hear that, but I want you to also hear this. We serve a God who can make all things new. And I'm not trying to frustrate you, ma'am. I'm not trying to frustrate you, sir. I'm not trying to lecture you or make you feel bad, shame you or guilt you or make you walk away feeling worse. If anything, I hope what you're hearing is we care about you, we love you, and we care about marriages in this church because God cares about marriage. And it's not just something we want to talk about, but it's something that we want to offer support in and walk with whatever situation you may be in. And the truth is, if we're honest, we're all a little broken. Right? And we all could use some encouragement and hope, and we all could use some resources and tools to better do life together. So I want to assure you, this is a safe place to work through your stuff and to be honest with yourselves and let God heal us. So I realize the weight of a series like this, and I bring these messages, as I've been saying, with a little bit of hesitancy because I myself am no marriage expert. And as I study and prepare, and as I realize how my relationships are going and how my marriage is going, I'm realizing, man, I often blow it as well. I'm not getting it right all the time either. But ultimately, marriages, the way we treat one another, relationships are really important to God. Every Tuesday morning, I start my week off by looking through the prayer requests that you guys put in on Sunday in the offering boxes. So like this Tuesday, I'll be doing the same thing. And so I start looking over those, I start praying over those, and then what I do is I write a devotional that I send out to the prayer team with the lists and the requests that you have kind of put in. And unlike before, the Tuesday morning before we kicked off this series, I noticed maybe with greater awareness, the prayers for relationships and the prayers for marriages. So I got curious and I went back a few weeks and looked at the prayer requests, and I started to notice just how many requests were directly about marriages and relationships. Please pray for my marriage, we're falling apart. Please pray for my husband, he doesn't want to come to church. Please pray for my wife, she left, and I don't think we can recuperate this. We got a prayer request from a young person. Please pray for my mom and dad that they would stop fighting and that they would stop drinking and that there would be unity in the home. Please pray for my friends. Please pray for my family members. Please pray for my co-worker. On and on and on it went. And God confirmed in my heart, relationships need help. Marriages are in trouble. And ironically enough, later on that day, I'm scrolling through Facebook and social media and couple after couple with profile pictures, cheek to cheek and just so happy and hashtag love my spouse, relationship goals, best wife ever. And if you've been married for a while and if you've been in any sort of relationships, chances are you know this dynamic. You know what I'm talking about. We're going to fake it till we make it, right? And you're trying to figure out things, how to do things, and they're just not going well. And you're going through a season that's especially challenging, and yet nobody knows about it. And you don't want nobody to know about it. And you're okay with that. And I'm just convinced that within our church, within our community, within our world, we're in a season where a lot of people are struggling with marriage, with their relationships, and they're not really sure how to deal with it or how to talk much about it, and even where to turn. So here's my goal, and I'm going to illustrate this through a story. A few years ago, my family and I, we went to Mount Hood. My son was about 6 or 7 years old, and we went a little past government camp, and there's kind of like this bunny hill where you can kind of sled, and the kids go out, and they take their sleds, and they have a great time. So we're out there with another family friend, and my son's sledding down this little bunny hill, and he's just sledding down and all these things, right? And so he goes down with his sled, and he kind of falls over, and he's trying to kind of gather himself and compose himself, pick up his sled. In the meantime, probably like a 50-year-old lady just bombing down the hill. And I'm seeing this collision about to happen. I'm like, Levi, come on, buddy, move. Like, Levi, lady, you're going to slow down, right? Nope, she's just bang, takes him out, right? Like, takes his feet from under him. Poor kid does a nosedive, boom, right with his face in the snow, right? Now, listen, Romanians, I know we got big noses, but this is like 3 times bigger, okay? I actually wanted to put a picture up of him because we took a picture, but, lately I've been asking for permission to say certain things up here and to do certain things, and I got a hard no, so I'm learning, okay? Like relationship goals, right? So he busts his nose, and he's having an absolute meltdown. We get him in the car. We drive over to government camp, and we get into the ski patrol booth, and there's a young man who comes there, and he's a really nice guy, and he starts examining him. He starts looking at him and telling us the story of the mountain and how treacherous it is and how careful we got to be. And then he starts telling us about the etymology of the nose, and I'm like, at one point, like, dude, I don't care about all that. Like, he's cold and he's hurting. Can you just give him some medication? That's all we need. A blanket maybe and some meds. That's it. And I think what some people experience when they come to church, right? They've got this pain that they're dealing with, and they're tried a lot of other things, and they didn't really want to come to church, but now they're here, and they're trying, to see if this will work out, and they sometimes sit through a lecture in church, and they get a lot of Greek and a lot of history, and that really doesn't help much. In fact, it makes them feel bad about the pain that they're actually in, and there's very little help on what to do next. And what they need is just some good medicine and a blanket. That's it. They need some hope from Jesus. So that's our heart behind this series. We want you to not walk out here cold and hurting. We want you to walk out here a little warmer with some hope from Jesus. So my prayer for you and my hope is and desire is that you would please reach out and please let us know, like, hey, we're struggling. We have plenty of resources. We'll even foot bills on some of these things. Just let us know. We want to help you. Some of you have already reached out. God bless you. Thank you for that. But we want to be of service to you. Now, here's why this is important. Marriages and relationships are intended to reflect God's love for us. So Jesus said in John chapter 13, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you." And what made this command new, it wasn't that it was brand new, as in they hadn't heard it before. It's just that Jesus showed us a new way of loving, a new way that he exemplified, a way that was full of grace, a way that was full of compassion and kindness, a way that was committed and unconditional. And when we love each other that way, we're showing the world what the love of God is supposed to look like. See, when we talk about marriage, we're talking about God's love. So let me say it this way. The glory of God is at stake in our relationships. This is what Paul says in Ephesians 5, in the middle of his talk between marriage and union. He stops and he says, hey, look, there's a supernatural mystery here. I'm not just talking about marriage anymore. I'm talking about Jesus and the church. And the way that Jesus loved the church is the way that we're to love one another in marriage. In fact, in any relationship. Marriage is not just about you being fulfilled and happy in life, although that's a big part of it. But when we're talking about marriage, it should reflect the kind of love that we have received from God. And marriage, in my opinion, is the best illustration of that kind of love that we received that we're now to have towards others. All right, so that's the why behind this. What do we do when we experience conflict? When you're in a heated argument, when you're in a heated disagreement, how do you de-escalate? How do you resolve those things? Now, the first thing I want you to hear this morning is that all relationships have conflict. Conflict can be healthy and conflict can be unhealthy. You cannot make the goal of any relationship no conflict. It's just not going to happen, okay? Everybody fights. My wife and I, we fight. In fact, our last fight, I had her crawling on her hands and knees, everybody. I really did. And she was looking under that bed and she said, "Come out of there and fight like a man." Right? Okay, so most marriages and relationships are marked by conflict. And at minimum, it's intermittent conflict, and sometimes it's all-out war. Now, it's helpful to realize that conflict is normal and that discord happens in every marriage, no matter how spiritual they are, no matter how, quote, godly they are, or how ideal they think their marriage is. I actually know a premarital counselor who will not do counseling if the couple has never been in a fight. He says you're not ready to get married if you've never experienced a fight and dealt with it. Here's what Paul says about this reality. He says, those who marry will face many troubles in life. It's almost as if like he's sparing us from thinking otherwise. And I think that we will agree that most people go into marriage or relationships, most of us do, with underdeveloped conflict resolution skills. We were never taught how to de-escalate or diffuse conflict. We certainly didn't learn it from our parents. If, in fact, they may have been a terrible model for us on how to conflict resolve because nobody taught them either. There's no classes on conflict in school. You're not going to take a class on how to de-escalate a conflict, yet it's one of the most important skills that you can have in life. Now, when conflict typically occurs, when we fight, we have two primary responses. Write some of these things down. The first primary response is avoid. We want to avoid. We avoid conversations, we avoid interaction, avoid texting people back. It's called ghosting them, right? We work late on purpose, knowing that our partner or our spouse is already in bed, so we don't have to talk to them. I remember with my wife, I would purposely wait for her to leave the kitchen before I went into the kitchen so that in some odd way, I don't even want to make eye contact with you. I don't even want to breathe the same air that you're breathing in the kitchen, right? Or we would be sleeping in bed and I would just kind of huddle as close as I could to the edge of the bed and kind of use the blanket to pull away just in case. I'm not going to let my foot even remotely have the possibility of touching her foot, right? And she would be on the other side of her bed kind of crunched up all the way on the edge. And there was this line between us that it was invisible, but we're not crossing it. I'm not making the first move and neither is she. We're avoiding each other. Anybody else want to be honest this morning? Right? We went to a concert Friday night, and my wife, we sat down, and my wife's like, "Wow, these seats are really small." And then she turns to me, "Are these seats small, or am I just really big?" Avoid, 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 avoid. Trap, right? Now listen, men, sometimes it's okay to avoid, okay? But oftentimes it's not, all right? Years ago, listen to this. There was a company called Breakup Shop. And this was a company that would help you break up with somebody. So for $10, you pay them $10, they would send a text to that person on your behalf. For $20, they would write a handwritten note on your behalf and say, "Hey, we're done." For $30, they would call that person and tell them, "Hey, sorry, it's over." See, there's something in us that avoids discomfort, not for the other person's sake, but for ours. So when conflict comes, a lot of people, what we do is we just avoid. Hey, listen, I don't want to rock the boat. I sweep everything under the rug. I just take it. I grin. I bear it. I just avoid and ignore the areas that cause us conflicts. I want peace no matter what, therefore I avoid. Well, that doesn't help at all. In fact, I would say that's really an unhealthy way to deal with conflict, maybe even a toxic way of dealing with conflict, because it doesn't grow your marriage, friendship, or any relationship for that matter. The second primary response that we have to conflict is to attack. If something's not going well, I'm going to destroy you. Right? And this is common practice now because of technology. We have become so distracted socially that we have separated into us and them categories across the boundary of technology. And what do? We just lob bombs over to one another. I can say horrible things about you, about others, because I don't have to look at the pain in your eyes. Right? You just go to any comment section of any article. I actually love to do this. I won't even read the article. I'll just read the headline and go to the comment section, right? And I'm reading the comment section, and what's the first thought that I think? Wow, people are genius. Who comes up with this stuff, right? And then I start to think, wow, how sad. These people are probably not saying those things face to face. They're just doing it online. Now, maybe a small portion of people would have the courage to actually say these things face to face, but for the most part, you would never say such hurtful things to that person if they were right there. We were just not that cruel. But this happens. And in marriage, it often happens when communication has devolved into texting or when you badmouth your spouse in front of your family, in front of your friends, or even worse, in front of your kids. Why? Because there's no personal interaction, no eye-to-eye contact, so we think it's safe. Now, sadly, I did this early on in my marriage as well. It was really easy just to blast a text message to my wife, and it was really easy to be rude, to dismiss her, and to be mean. Why? Because I didn't have to look her in the eyes. I didn't have to deal with the pain that was associated there. I remember specifically in a conflict that we had. In fact, it's so funny, we fight about it to this day still. Right? And it happened when we were dating, and the way I remember it, okay, and I'm right, but the way I remember it, the way I remember is that she sent me a text message with the ring that she wanted me to buy her, right? And it had the specific band, it had the carats that she wanted, it had the clarity, the cut, all the four diamond, the seas of diamonds or whatever. And oh man, my blood started boiling. And I was like, oh, heck no, I ain't marrying no gold digger. And so I was like texting her back, and I was like, hey, nope, what if I'm broke and I don't have money? I can't buy the da-da-da-da-da-da, right? So she blasts back. She says, no, that never happened, right? And so we called and talked about it in real time. I remember it exactly like that. She says, no, I never sent you those pictures. I wish I remembered those texts. Should have saved those. Okay. Attack, right? So we do one of two things. We either attack or we avoid. I'm just going to completely ignore you as if you don't exist, or I'm going to be vicious to you when I don't have to acknowledge your humanity. And when you dehumanize someone, it's really easy to be inhumane towards them. And it's not only in marriage, right? We live in a culture now of hate and anger right now where we avoid each other or we attack each other. And listen, a community like that cannot stand. It really can't. Now, the good news is for you and I this morning is that there is a better way. There is a different way to treat each other, and the church offers something different. It is possible to enter into conflict and enter into tension with the hope of redemption. So the goal of today is to help you deal with conflict in a healthy way. How do you fight right? How do you fight healthy? So I want to give you God's way of dealing with conflict, and that will serve sort of as a backdrop for the way that we're going to deal with conflict one with another. Now, the world deals with conflict. In fact, the word that you often hear surrounding conflict is the word resolution. Now, what a resolution is, you keep kind of working out, trying to figure out who did what, who was right, who was wrong. You try to find a winner and a loser, right? This often takes a lot of time and can usually take a toll on a relationship. There's a lot of back and forth, finger pointing, blaming, and trust is fractured. Oftentimes, feelings are hurt. Eventually, there is some sort of compromise and resolution. The Bible, however, does it a different way. You don't resolve a conflict, you reconcile a conflict. The Bible calls it conflict reconciliation. It's very different. To reconcile something means to bring back together, not by resolving or compromise, but by bringing the balance of an account to zero. That's what Jesus did with us. He came in, he saw the mess that was our lives. We didn't discuss our sins. He didn't discuss my sin. He just came in and forgave my sin. He cleansed me of my sin, forgave my sin, and there was no discussion. And thank God for it. We probably would have spent 4 hours on 1997 alone. Come on, somebody, right? No, he just came in and said, hey, you get a do-over. Your sins are forgiven. The debt was canceled. It was reconciled. This is where in banking, you have a banking reconciliation statement where you reconcile what the bank says with what your spending was. Now, young people, you're not going to know what I'm talking about, but eons ago, there was a thing called checkbooks. Come on, boomers, where you at, right? This is your moment to shine, right? And so you would write these checks, and it was like cash. But at the end of the checkbook, I remember my parents, and they had this reconciliation part, right, where you would look at all the intakes, you would look at all the outtakes, and at the end, you would add them all up, and what were they supposed to equal? 0, right? And if they didn't equal 0, what would you do? You'd go back and kind of rework the numbers until it was reconciled. So this is how God deals with conflicts. He brings your heart's balance to 0 and then gives you the ability to do it to others. Let me show it to you in the Bible. This is Ephesians 2:14-16. For Christ himself, listen to this, has brought peace to us. So that can happen. Okay, Christ can bring peace to your marriage, to your heart, to your life, to your relationships. How did he do it? Look what he says next. He united two groups that were fighting. Now, in this case, it was the Jews and Gentiles, but you could enter any two groups in that equation. Husbands, wives, parents, kids, Republicans, Democrats. Right? He united them, Jews and Gentiles, into one people when in his body on the cross, so Jesus took the first step, he broke down the wall of hostility that separated us. He made peace between Jews and Gentiles by creating in himself one new people from two groups, together as one body. Here's the word, Christ reconciled. So because he forgave me, because he did that, he let my balance go to 0. He reconciled me. He reconciled both groups to God by means of his death on the cross, and our hostility towards one another was put to death. So our hostility, our conflict towards one another can be 0. So through Jesus, God brings our balance to 0, and now he asks us to do the same. Look at this, 2 Corinthians 5:18. All this is from God who what? Reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us what ministry? The ministry of reconciliation. So that God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. So that's what reconciliation is. You bring the count to 0. And he has committed to you and I, to us, the message of reconciliation. In other words, we are now to go do it to others. So when we are reconciled with God, he gives us the power to reconcile with others. So biblically, this is really important. It's not just a resolution, it's reconciliation. When you allow God to reconcile your anger, the conflict, the hostility, to bring that account to 0, a miracle can really happen in your life, and a miracle can happen in the world around you. So how do we do it? How do we do it, Pastor? I'm going to give you some practical examples that will help you, okay? Now, this is not going to be an exhaustive list on how to deal with conflict. I mean, we could do entire series on this topic alone, but I want to give you some big picture, high-level things that you can start with that'll really build a foundation for how to deal with conflict in your life. We're going to pull these from 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8-11. Listen to what this says. Finally, all of you should be of one mind, sympathizing with one another, loving each other as brothers and sisters. Be tender-hearted and keep a humble attitude. Don't repay evil for evil. Don't retaliate with insults when people insult you. Instead, pay them back with a blessing. This is what God has called you to do, and he will grant you his blessing. For the scriptures say, if you want to enjoy life and see many happy days, who doesn't want to do that, right? It says, keep your tongue from speaking evil and your lips from telling lies. Turn away from evil, do good, search for peace, and work to maintain it. All right, we're going to unpack this. Here's some takeaways, really practically. Jot these down if you're taking notes. Here's the first thing to remember in conflict reconciliation, and that is we got to sympathize with one another. Sympathize with one another. To be sympathetic means to try and understand and validate someone's feelings. Now listen, it doesn't mean that we have to validate the behavior or what they do. We may disagree with the conclusions or behaviors, but the goal is to try to understand where that person is coming from. There are two basic needs that all of us have in life as individuals: the need to be understood and the need to be affirmed. And sympathy accomplishes both of those. I try often when I start a conversation, when I know conflict is present, to start the conversation with, hey, help me understand how you arrived at this conclusion. Help me understand how you arrived at this behavior. Jerry Maguire used to say, help me help you, right? Shout out to a good movie. Okay, Philippians 2:4 says this: let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. In other words, we got to try to understand their perspective, sympathize. Now, what often gets us in trouble during conflict is that we have good perception, but we have not so good perspective. Okay, listen, those words sound the same, but they're often interchangeable, but they mean two very different things. Perception has everything to do with how you see the world around you through your five senses. So what you see, what you hear, what you taste. Well, that didn't bother me. Why should it bother you? I wasn't offended by that. Why are you offended by that? Like, it's not a big deal. Why is it a big deal to you? Right? Perception is subject to how you see things. Having the right perspective, however, is to use objective, measurable facts outside of what you see to gain a larger perspective or a larger view. So, for example, my temperament is different than yours. My background is different than yours. My attitudes towards life and issues are different than yours. I need some perspective, not just my perception when I relate to other people. For example, I may be colorblind in one eye, and my perception of the world may be that everything in life is just black and white, when the reality is that it isn't. So that's the difference between perception and perspective. Now listen, I'm not saying this is easy, especially in real time. It's not easy, and here's why. It's not natural. I'm naturally a self-centered person. I am by nature not interested in you. I am more interested in me versus anybody else. Only Jesus can change my want to. Only Jesus can change my perspective. Only Jesus can make me interested in what you have gone through so that I can sympathize with you. So we're going to need his help to do this. Stephen Covey, in 7 Habits of a Highly Effective Person, he says this: seek first to understand, then seek to be understood. I love this principle from Walt Whitman as well. I do not ask the wounded person how he feels. I become the wounded person. In other words, I put myself in that person's shoes. I try to sympathize with them. This is exactly what Jesus did with us. Here's what it says: for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So he wanted perspective. He came into this life, became one of us so that he can get perspective. Now, the opposite of sympathy is apathy and indifference. So to avoid being insensitive, to avoid being heartless and apathetic, we need to create some boundaries, listen, in advance around conflict. I did not do this early on in my marriage, and it cost me dearly because simple conflicts ended up going too far, and fights can happen anytime and anywhere, as we all know. So if you don't have these boundaries, there's going to be a lot of collateral damage that can happen along the way that ends up adding to the fight. What could have been easily handled now becomes more intense because we lack the boundaries to preserve ourselves from being heartless, from being insensitive, from being apathetic in our responses and in our actions. So here are a few boundaries. You can write these down if you find them helpful, that my wife and I have learned along the way from others and have tried to put into practice. Here are just a few. We never fight in public. That's a really good boundary. That's a boundary for us. We try to always be able to okay, time out. We got to push the time out button. We're going to take this in a private setting. When it's not private, it adds fuel to the fire because of embarrassment, because of people around, because of the influence from others around. Here's another good one. Never fight in front of the kids. This one is huge, huge. Now, we weren't always good at this growing up. As Levi would always call us out, and he would say, hey, why are you guys arguing? And we would both, with raised tones, turn around and yell at him, we're not yelling, right? it was funny because when he was younger, we would argue, and we said, okay, we don't want to argue in front of the kids, so what are we going to do? We're going to argue in Romanian. So we would start arguing in Romanian, right? And he would just sit there and he would say, stop arguing in Spanish. So it's awesome. Here's another good one. Never fight physically, right? So it's never physical. Now, listen, I have lived up to this. Thank you, Jesus. My wife, on the other hand, not so much. She's forgiven in Jesus' name. Just kidding. Here's a really important one. Never stomp off. So we don't avoid. We always try to talk it out. We never just say, nope, I'm out of here. I'm not even dealing with this. Here's the final one. This is really important. Never shut down. In other words, write it down this way. No appeasing. Now, this is huge. Now, usually in relationships, there's one yeller and one person that usually will shut down. Both of those are dangerous long term. Of course, yelling, but also shutting down, checking out, just giving in for the sake of peace. Well, I'm just going to concede, don't want to deal with this, hope it goes away. That's not peace, that's called codependency. Okay? You can't just appease for the sake of peace. Because if you do that, before you know it, you're going to disconnect emotionally, and conflict festers, and it gets worse, and now there are greater and bigger problems. Okay, here's the second thing with conflict reconciliation. Jot this down. You got to cooperate with each other. It's going to require some cooperation. Look at 1 Peter 3:8. Love each other as brothers and sisters, so we're on the same team. We cooperate. How do we do it? Tender-hearted, and we keep a humble attitude. Peter is saying here to reconcile conflict, we need to cooperate. We need to recognize we're not enemies. We're brothers and sisters in Christ. We don't need to compete with each other. We need to complement each other. We minimize conflict by maximizing cooperation. And Peter gives us 3 important action words here to diffuse conflict. Listen to these. Love, tender-hearted, which is another word for compassion, and humility. Love says, I will look out for the other person's best interest. It says, hey, let's stop attacking each other and let's start attacking the problem. Tender-heartedness or compassion says, let's not just talk about loving each other, let's demonstrate that love. Let's live that love out. Let's put that into action. And humility says that love is not proud. It admits when you're wrong. It admits faults. It's being honest about our weaknesses, about our failures, and about our needs. It uses phrases like, hey, I need help. I can't do this. I was wrong. Please forgive me. Colossians 3:12 gives us a little added insight into this. It tells us this. Put on. Listen to that phrase, put on. That means this is not something natural. We need to strive. We need to work at doing this as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility. I want you to pay close attention to that word humility, meekness, and patience. Now, this may surprise some of you, but conflict is actually spiritual. There's a spiritual dynamic to every fight. God and his spirit and the spirit of peace and unity are at work, but so is the enemy. He's also at work. And what we need to know is the enemy's primary tool, please listen, is pride. Think about it. This is why we so easily forget what a fight was really all about in the first place. When you think back on a fight or a disagreement, and you're like, man, I don't even know what we were fighting about. I can't even remember what the conversation was about. You want to know why? Because a fight always goes from the issues, the conflict, the thing, to us almost immediately. We are offended, we are frustrated, we are angry, our pride has taken a hit. It's all about me, and me. Psychologists call this injured pride or hurt pride, where we, our self-esteem, our self-worth feels challenged. And the enemy does this strategically to lie to us and make it all about us. And remember, his goal is to steal, kill, and destroy. And he uses pride to do it. And when pride comes in, we can't use logic. We can't use the world's reason to stand against it. We need something more powerful. And in the Bible, the antithesis to pride is actually humility. And that's what we need in the middle of a conflict. So I want you to write it down this way. Pride separates and destroys. Humility unites and heals every time. Pride will separate and destroy. Humility is what unites and heals. That's why James, in his book, he tells us, God opposes the proud, and he gives grace to the humble. Dr. John Gottman, I mentioned him a few weeks ago, a marriage relationship expert from the University of Washington, psychologist. He observed thousands of couples, and if you remember, he breaks them down into two categories, marriage masters and marriage disasters. And he says marriage disasters have four behaviors in common, and he refers to them as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The four horsemen of the apocalypse, of course, is a metaphor depicting the end times in the New Testament. They describe conquest, war, famine, and death. And he says these are accurate predictors of divorce. So here are these four behaviors of a miserable marriage. You can write these down. The first one is criticism, where you're always complaining about the spouse. The second one is defensiveness, where we always get, defensive in our responses, and we always take it really personal. Stonewalling is the third one, blowing your partner off, tuning out, turning away, and just acting busy, just totally ignoring. And the fourth one, he says, is contempt. And Gottman concludes that contempt is the biggest predictor of a disastrous marriage. All of these things have one thing in common. Have you picked up what it is? Pride. Pride. Now, let me be really honest with you. The last one that I struggle with on this list is the fourth one, contempt. And because we don't use that word contempt a lot, we don't really know what it means, but it means to speak of a spouse sarcastically, harshly, mockingly, to use sarcasm and criticism that is personal and it's condescending. And early on in my marriage, to my shame, this was me. Like, I would joke about my wife and think it was cute and funny, and just tease her about her accent and tease her about, she's still at FOB and fresh off the boat, things like that. And I would do it amongst friends. It was not cute. It was me being prideful. I wasn't acting in humility, wasn't acting loving, wasn't tender toward my wife. And God had to really deal with me on this. And I had to ask God, could you please deal with me? Like, I need a clear picture of myself. Break this thing. It's one of the scariest things I've ever had to pray. It's also one of the most profound things I've ever done. And here's the verse that I learned through this, and I try to pray often. Last two verses of Psalm 139, look what they say. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Do you know when you get in a conflict, anxiety begins to rise? Nervousness begins to rise. And he says, hey, search me. Point that out in me. Don't point it out in my spouse. Don't point it out in my kid or in my neighbors no, in me. See if there's any offensive way in me. Point it out and lead me to the way of everlasting. So pray that for yourself when you're in conflict or you're trying to diffuse or you're trying to reconcile it. We need to allow the Spirit of God to come into a relationship and bring humility. It's only that. Without humility, we'll never accomplish verse 9 that we read. Don't repay evil for evil. Don't retaliate when insults are brought towards you. Instead, pay them back with a blessing. This is what God has called you to do, and he will grant you his blessing. That can only happen with humility. Without humility, we don't have a chance of accomplishing that. Here's the key. You got to make a decision. You can't wait for the other person. If you wait on the other person, it'll never happen. You have to choose to go first. Now, I'm going to say something strong. If you're not cooperating, if you're not giving in to your spouse, you're actually giving in to the devil. And he's going to tear you guys apart. So you have to make a choice. I'm going to cooperate, I'm going to work with my spouse, or I'm going to give in to the devil. Here's the third thing. Two more quick ones and we'll close. Third thing we remember in conflict reconciliation, we got to control the tongue. Control the tongue with one another. This one is so powerful. This is huge. This could be the most important one, maybe the one that we need to start with. Verse 10 in our passage said, If you want to enjoy life and see many happy days, keep your tongue from speaking evil and your lips from telling lies. We need to learn to not be deceitful. We need to learn to not tell half-truths. We got to be honest with one another. We got to watch our tongues. We need to control those things. The prophet Isaiah prophesied and said that when Jesus was led to be crucified, he did not even open his mouth. He was silent like a lamb led to the slaughter. Jesus, who above all had the right to retaliate with his words, he chose to demonstrate perfect self-control in order to accomplish his redemptive work. Now, next week, we're going to have a whole message on communication, so I won't dwell on this long. But today, here's what's crucial that I want you to understand. Words are important, but equally, if not more important, is the tone that we use. And the way that we say things, we may be saying the right things, but the tone that we use actually diminishes and hides everything that we're saying. Because it's very easy to raise our tone as a form of domination and control in a conversation. This is why Proverbs 15:1 says that a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Two things I learned about tone in conversation this week. Josh Moore, go ahead and raise your hand. If you want more on this, he's an expert in this field. He can tell you more about this. You're going to be real proud of what I'm going to share right now and what I was reading this week. All right. So there are different areas of function in your brain, right? The highest level of your brain is the prefrontal lobe or the cortex. That's where you have the capacity to speak. That's where you have the capacity to strategize, to plan, think, reason, and self-control. When you're using your cortex, you're thinking smart. You're much more likely to be able to rationally work on a problem and resolve it creatively when you're in your cortex part of your brain. There is another part of your brain called the limbic system, which is dominated by emotion and impulse. This could be considered a lower part of brain function, right? When you get fearful or when you get afraid, when you get angry or you drop out of your cortex, you know what happens? You move down into the limbic part of the brain, which is just instinctual, somewhat primal. And at that point, you don't think straight. That's why you hear guys all the time, man, I don't know what happened, Pastor. I just saw red and boom, I hit her. Right? This is where we think dumb and we start name calling and we get mad and yell and we say things we regret and we do things that we regret because you're down in that limbic part of your brain. Anytime you're in a conflict and you start to get fearful or you start to get angry, you drop out of the cortex and you go into this limbic system and you're just not smart anymore, okay? You do and say dumb stuff. So let me say it this way. The more my tone rises, the more the lower my intelligence becomes. It's true. So listen, it's okay if you find yourself in a situation when tension is high, when you see emotion rising in you to say, hey, time out. I need to cool off. I'm in the wrong part of my brain. I'm going to say something that I'm going to regret. I'm not thinking straight. Can we take a break? Okay, this is also important because I found something else out, Josh, that you're going to appreciate. We have in our brains what's called mirror neurons. Now, this was fascinating. Mirror neurons are ability to feel what you see. Okay, so the only reason you like going to movies is because God gave you mirror neurons. So when you see somebody kissing on screen, like we feel that kiss, right? When you see somebody getting in a fight and wanting to get revenge, we feel that revenge. We want to get revenge on that person. When you see somebody get angry in a movie, we get angry. When you see emotions rise in a movie, our emotions rise. Why? Because these are called mirror neurons, right? When you see Vin Diesel on the screen and he says, I only live my life a quarter mile at a time, I'm like, I want to live my life a quarter. Okay, never mind. You get the point, right? Mirror neurons, okay? And because we have these mirror neurons in argument, whatever you put out is what you get back. So if you get angry, they're going to get angrier. If you start yelling, they're going to start yelling. If you get sarcastic, they're going to become sarcastic. Mirror neurons, they're reflecting back what you're doing. This is why Ecclesiastes 9:17 says this, the words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. So important. You got to watch your words, but just as important, if not more important, you got to watch the tone with which you share those words. Finally, last one, write this down and we'll close. Conflict reconciliation pursues peace. Pursues peace. Look at verse 11, the last part. Turn away from evil, do good. What does it say? Say it with me together. Search for peace. Yeah, we got to look for it. We got to look for it. We got to be peacemakers. We must learn to pursue peace with a passion in our conflict. Listen, when we're in conflict, remember, it should never be about personal victory or being right. Even a dead clock is right twice a day, right? Being right is overrated. No, the goal is love, compassion, peace, unity. Harmony is another word. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. He doesn't say, blessed are those who are right. He said, blessed are those who seek peace and make peace. Now, really important, really quick, peacemaking and peacekeeping are two very different things. Okay, I used to have a chaplain friend when I was in the VA as a chaplain who would get deployed on a number of tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. And after the U.S. would go into a city and bomb it, or there was a lot of war and a lot of destruction, a team of soldiers with the chaplain would go behind what all that happens to be peacekeepers to control the behaviors and to make sure that new fighting wouldn't begin. And what they would do is they would go out and bribe people, literally. They would just give out a bunch of money to folks and say, hey, here, sorry for your loss. Here's some money. Hopefully you don't escalate this and start anything new. That's peacekeeping, right? Peacemaking requires more of us. Peacekeepers avoid conflict and pretend it doesn't exist, or they just deal with behaviors, but peacemakers resolve conflict and reconcile the relationships because it deals with the heart. Because it deals with the heart. Last verse and we close. James 3:18. Worship team, you can come up. Listen to this. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. I love that. So think about this. When you plant a seed in the ground, it's small, it's often insignificant, you often don't think much about it, right? But when it starts to blossom, when it starts to grow, it produces a huge harvest. If you plant a seed of an apple, you get an apple tree with many apples in return. It's the law of sowing and reaping. So if you plant a seed of conflict, you'll end up with a lot more trouble than you bargained for. But the Bible says that if you plant a seed of peace in your home, in your marriage, in your family, in your children, in your relationships, you're going to harvest peace, kindness, goodness, and in return, righteousness. This is, in fact, what Jesus did. The Prince of Peace came to bring us peace. He sowed peace through his death, and the Bible says that he is the first fruit of the resurrection. And the book of Colossians says that he has made peace with everything in heaven and on earth by means of Christ's blood on the cross. So he sowed peace, and now he is reaping a harvest of righteousness. A harvest of righteousness that is us, his church. A harvest of righteousness that is us, his people. A harvest of righteousness that is us, his bride. So I want to encourage you, always pursue peace. Be intentional. Be intentional about pursuing peace. Listen, you can do this. We can do this. We can resolve conflict. We can reconcile conflict. We can fight in healthy ways, or we can fight in unhealthy ways. Let's do it in healthy, God-honoring ways. Amen?